We usually think of hunger as a problem of scarcity, right? That there's just not enough food to go around. But what if that's not the real story? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden structure of our global food system, an architecture that actually produces more than enough food for everyone, yet somehow leaves millions and millions hungry. Let's dive in and see how that's even possible.
And this quote really gets to the heart of the paradox we're talking about. A system that was designed to nourish has somehow morphed into a machine that literally profits from hunger. And as you're about to see, this wasn't some accident. It was built this way.
So, to really understand how this machine works, first we have to get our heads around the sheer scale of the numbers. And believe me, they are staggering.
Okay, get this. Every single year, governments around the world pour $540 billion into agriculture. With that kind of money, you'd think we could solve world hunger, like yesterday.
But here's the kicker. A whopping 87% of that money, that's $470 billion, is actually harmful. It's not just wasted. It actively distorts markets, it damages the environment, and it props up the biggest corporate players, not the small farmers who actually need the help. And this is the human cost. While hundreds of billions of dollars are being misdirected, 811 million people go to bed hungry. 3 billion people can't even afford a healthy diet. The money is there, but the system's architecture is fundamentally broken, pushing it away from the people it's supposed to help.
So, you have to ask, how was a system like this built in the first place? Well, let's take a look at the actual architecture of control. It's all about how monopoly is engineered. These are the tools they use to build the machine. Things like price incentives, tariffs, and direct subsidies. They're often sold to us as support for farmers. But what they really do is create a scaffolding for an oligopoly. That's a market totally dominated by just a few huge companies. It systematically lowers costs for the corporate giants and basically pushes small family farmers right out of the picture. So how did we let this happen? You could call it a case of regulatory amnesia. See, there was a time when antitrust laws, the rules designed to prevent monopolies and keep things fair, were taken very, very seriously. But over the last few decades, the focus shifted to something called efficiency. And that was basically code for letting massive companies merge and grow without any checks. The watchdogs, they were pretty much encouraged to go to sleep. And just look at the result of that amnesia. It is absolutely insane. Just 4 companies, 4, control 85% of the beef market. And get this, 4 companies control a staggering 90% of the entire global grain trade. This isn't a competitive market, folks. This is a cartography of control. All of this control has led to something even more, well, disturbing. It's the transformation of food from what should be a basic human right into just another financial asset, something to be traded and speculated on for massive profit. I mean, check out this timeline. Starting around 2010, banks and hedge funds just flooded into food commodity markets. What happened? Prices went completely wild. And the result? By 2012, banks had raked in over $2 billion. Not from growing food, not from feeding people, but from betting on price swings that left millions unable to afford to eat. This might be the most chilling part of the whole story. When a crisis hits, like the war in Ukraine, the system doesn't see a human tragedy. It sees an opportunity. To a trading algorithm, all that volatility, the disruption, the suffering, it's just smoke. And that smoke is a buy signal. And here's what that looks like in dollars and cents. In 2022, while the whole world was worried about grain shortages, the top 10 hedge funds made nearly $2 billion just from the chaos. This is profit built directly on the back of a crisis, often disguised as just inflation.
And this crazy disconnect runs through the entire supply chain. The farmers, the ones who actually create the value, are often forced to sell at a loss. But by the time that food gets to us, the price has been inflated by a long chain of middlemen, and all that real value just evaporates into fees and premiums. Okay, I know, it's a pretty bleak picture, but here's the important part. This system was built by people, by policy, by choices, and that means we have the power to redesign it. So, what if the blueprint could be rewritten? What would that even look like? Let's talk about that. Let's look at a framework for a new system, one that's actually designed for nourishment and resilience and fairness, not extraction and control. And here's the beautiful thing. For every single flaw in the old architecture, there's a direct corresponding solution. Instead of subsidizing monopolies, we can fund local food systems. Instead of encouraging speculation, we can mandate total transparency.
We can wake up those watchdogs, revive our antitrust laws, and build decentralized, resilient networks that actually serve people.
And hey, these aren't just vague ideas. We're talking about concrete actions. We can take that $470 billion in harmful subsidies and redirect it to real innovation and conservation. We can actually break up the corporate giants that have a stranglehold on our food. And we can build systems like cooperatives that shorten that supply chain, keeping value and power right in the communities that create it.
The bottom line is, none of this is inevitable. The system we have right now is a product of choices. Choices about policy, finance, and frankly, political will. And that means we can make different choices. We absolutely have the power to dismantle this thing and build something better in its place.
So, I guess the ultimate question is for us. We've seen the blueprint of the problem, and we know what a better design could look like. This architecture was built by human hands. The real question is, do we have the collective will to rebuild it?
So what if the global system that's supposed to feed all of us is actually built to profit from our hunger? It's a pretty provocative question, and that's exactly the argument we're digging into today. The source material for this explainer sees our food system not as a way to nourish people, but as a carefully designed architecture of inequity. It's a huge claim, so let's break down the blueprint it lays out.
And this, right here, is the central, kinda shocking thesis. The argument is that the system we all rely on for our food has been totally re-engineered. Its main purpose, according to this analysis, isn't feeding humanity anymore. It's extracting wealth. And it does that by preying on the very hunger it was meant to solve. Just think about that for a second. A machine that actually feeds on hunger.
So how is a machine like this funded? Well, every single year, governments around the world pour $540 billion into agriculture. But the source argues this money isn't really nurturing life. Instead of helping small farmers or sustainable practices, it's basically a massive ongoing subsidy for a handful of monopolies, just oiling the gears of that extraction machine. Which brings us right to our first section, the hunger machine. How does this thing actually work? We're going to look at how this whole financial structure is built, how it operates, and maybe most importantly, who it's failing to serve. You know, these government interventions, things like price incentives, tariffs, subsidies, they're officially called support. But the analysis we're looking at presents them in a totally different light. They act like scaffolding for oligopolies. That's just a fancy word for a handful of giant companies that dominate a market. This support lowers their costs and their risks, while smaller, local farmers are pretty much left to drown. And here is the staggering human cost of that system. While hundreds of billions of dollars are flowing into corporate bank accounts, 811 million people are going hungry. The very system that fails to feed them just keeps getting fatter and more profitable every single year. And the projection for the future? It's pretty grim. This source estimates that by 2030, this misdirection of funds could skyrocket to $1.7 trillion a year. It's framed not just as a bad policy, but as a real existential threat. The source even has this chilling line: we are funding our own extinction, in bulk. So how is this whole system held in place? Let's move on and see how it's all built. We're going to deconstruct what the source calls the pillars of inequity. These are the core structural components that, according to this analysis, are the very foundation of this broken system. The first pillar is something the source calls regulatory amnesia. See, there was a time when antitrust laws, the rules designed to stop any one company from getting too powerful, were actually used to ensure justice and fair competition. But then, the argument goes, this new ideology took over, one that was all about so-called efficiency metrics. And that basically allowed corporations to merge and consolidate like crazy. The watchdogs, you could say, learned to sleep on the job. And this chart, wow, this really shows you the result of that amnesia. Just look at the US beef industry. A mere 4 companies control a staggering 85% of the market. Let that sink in for a second. That's not competition. The source calls this a cartography of control. The second pillar, the tax system. And this quote just captures the argument perfectly. It's a temple of loopholes. For example, the meat giant JBS allegedly hid $442 million in tax havens, legally dodging taxes that could have funded public services. It's a system where value isn't just created, it's strategically rerouted away from the public good and straight into private pockets. Okay, this leads us to a really crucial concept in this whole analysis, the financialized harvest. This is the point where food stops being about the farm and enters the casino of global finance. We're going to explore how our food has been turned from simple sustenance into a complex financial toy. So here's the crucial point. Food has been financialized. What does that even mean? It means profit isn't primarily made from the act of growing food and feeding people anymore. No, huge profits are made by betting on the future price of food. When you can bet on scarcity, on volatility, even on starvation, well, chaos itself becomes a profitable product. And this isn't just some abstract theory. This right here grounds that idea in a real-world event. When war broke out in Ukraine, threatening global grain supplies, the top 10 hedge funds made $1.9 billion betting on that very grain. The source puts it so bluntly, their algorithm saw the smoke and called it a buy signal. This is the mechanism the source calls the profit-price spiral. Just follow the chain here. It starts with something that seems unrelated, like rising natural gas prices. That spikes the cost of fertilizer, which farmers need. Then food costs inflate for all of us at the grocery store. And at every single step from the mine to your mouth, a little bit of rent is extracted until the consumer is choked by the price and the speculator at the end of the chain profits from all that volatility. And here's another form of extraction you've probably noticed yourself: shrinkflation. You ever feel like your bag of chips is half air? Yeah. The package gets smaller, but the price stays the same. The source describes this as how capital lies without speaking. It's a really subtle but powerful way to pass costs on and protect those profit margins. Now, after diagnosing the problem in such stark terms, the source doesn't just leave us in despair, which is good. It pivots to a blueprint for change, and it outlines a pretty hopeful vision for how this whole architecture could be fundamentally redesigned. And this is the turning point. The core message here is one of hope, one of agency. The blueprint can be rewritten. Of that huge pile of subsidies we saw earlier, an estimated $470 billion are just plain misdirected. That money isn't gone for good. It could become the seed capital for a new, more equitable food economy. So what would that new blueprint look like? The source proposes 4 main pillars. First, redirect those harmful subsidies towards things like conservation, innovation, and local food systems. Second, revive antitrust enforcement to break up the monopolies that control our food. Third, mandate radical price transparency, especially during a crisis, so we can actually see who's profiting. And fourth, actively support cooperative models that put power back into the hands of communities. Let's look a little closer at that last point. A new model emerges: cooperatives. You know, think of a local farm that sells its produce directly to a group of families in the community. These are structures that directly connect producers and consumers, and they cut out those extractive middlemen. In this model, value circulates inside the community, like oxygen, instead of being siphoned off as currency. And the ultimate goal of all of this is to build a decentralized and resilient infrastructure. The logic is actually pretty simple. When value stays close to where it's grown, when communities have control over their own food supply, the systems start to heal themselves. They become more like a forest with diverse and interconnected roots, rather than some fragile monoculture that can be wiped out by a single storm. This leaves us with a pretty fundamental question. This complex architecture, it wasn't an accident. It was built piece by piece through policy decisions, financial engineering, and just sheer political will. So the question is, can it be dismantled the same way? Can new policies, new financial models, and a new collective will tear it down and build something better in its place? I want to end with the final, really powerful statement from the source material. A system that feeds profit instead of people is not a system. It's a crime scene. But every crime scene is also a blueprint. We can redraw it. We must. It's a provocative thought to leave you with, turning a scene of crisis into a call for creation.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We're the show that, tries to unravel these really complex, interconnected global systems. We pull the threads, hoping to understand the hidden structures underneath. And today, we're tackling a big one, maybe the biggest. The global food supply. We've got a stack of sources here.
Yeah, quite a pile.
And they're making a really startling argument. It's actually pretty sobering when you get into it.
It is.
They basically argue that the system we built the one supposed to feed everyone. It's actually become something else entirely. They call it, and this is a direct quote, the most efficient extraction device ever designed.
That's a powerful phrase.
Isn't it? So we're diving deep into what these sources call the architecture of inequity. And our mission today, for you listening, is pretty focused. We want to quickly get a handle on how this massive, often opaque machine actually works.
Right, how the gears turn.
Exactly. How it ends up prioritizing financial profit way over actually nourishing people. And maybe most importantly, we want to look at the blueprints for change they propose. Real, tangible ideas.
Because the critique is harsh, but there are potential solutions offered.
For sure. But the starting point is grim. A system built to feed, that the sources say ultimately feeds on hunger.
It's a tough assessment, yeah. But you look at the numbers they lead with, and you immediately see why they use that kind of language. There's this deep structural flaw right from the outset.
Okay, like what? What's the first big flashing light?
Well, it's the sheer scale of public money going in versus what we're getting out. Or rather, who is getting it. We're talking about governments, taxpayers, you, pouring about $540 billion every year.
Into global agriculture.
Okay, $540 billion. That's a lot. And that's supposed to be for stability, right? Making sure there's enough food.
That's the idea, the ethical mandate, as you said. Food security, helping farmers, ensuring affordable nutrition. That's the promise.
There's always a but. But the analysis shows this catastrophic misdirection. 87% of that huge sum, that's, what, $470 billion a year?
Yeah, $470 billion.
Yeah. It's not going to the small farmers trying new things or, local food hubs or projects trying to farm more sustainably. No. It's channeled very systematically straight to the folks who are already powerful.
The big players.
The biggest. And the source material, it doesn't mince words here. They call this massive transfer explicitly a subsidy for monopoly.
Wow. Okay. A subsidy for monopoly. Not a fund for life, like you'd hope. That changes the whole picture, doesn't it?
It completely reframes it.
It suggests the system isn't failing because it's, clumsy or inefficient. It's failing because it's actually really efficient at doing the wrong thing.
Exactly. It's perfectly designed for extraction, not nourishment.
So how does that $470 billion actually get misdirected? Is it just direct cash payments to big companies?
It's more complex than just handing over checks, though some of that happens. A lot of it flows through things like commodity-specific payments. So you get paid more if you grow vast amounts of corn or soy, for example.
Oh, okay.
Then there are insurance guarantees, which mostly benefit large operations that can afford the initial setup and have the scale to make the policies worthwhile, in various indirect price supports. Things that effectively lower the operating costs, but only really if you're operating at enormous scale.
So you need huge tracts of land, specialized, expensive equipment, stuff a small family farm just doesn't have.
Precisely. Small producers often don't even qualify for these programs, or the benefit is so minimal it doesn't really help them compete. The money follows size. It reinforces the advantage the giants already have.
Okay, so that really sets the stage for our deep dive today. We've got this massive fire hose of public money, biggest agricultural budget ever, but the result isn't less hunger. It's more inequality, more concentration of power, and still hundreds of millions going hungry.
A structural failure by design, as the sources argue.
Right. Let's unpack that architecture then. Let's figure out exactly how this money flows, who wins and who loses.
Okay, that takes us straight into the foundation of this inequality, these so-called support mechanisms.
Yeah.
The subsidies and how they build oligopoly.
Okay, so let's start with the language itself. Governments call these things support, right?
Yeah.
Price incentives, tariffs, subsidies. It all sounds helpful.
It sounds positive, yeah.
Yeah.
Protective, even. But the analysis we're looking at argues the actual effect is, well, corrosive.
Corrosive how?
The core argument is that this support is basically scaffolding for oligopoly. Think about it like this.
Yeah.
If you're a huge agricultural corporation, maybe a massive grain producer or a giant meat processor, these government programs drastically cut your operating costs per unit. Sometimes they push your effective cost below the true cost if you factor in environmental damage or fair labor practices, which often get ignored.
So the government is basically taking on some of the risk and the real costs for the biggest companies.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's a huge hidden advantage. And that lets these giants scale up even faster, grab more market share, often by setting prices in the global market that are artificially low, unsustainably low for anyone else.
Right. So Say a giant corporation gets, I don't know, $1 per bushel subsidy for corn. They can sell it for $3. But the small local farmer next door, maybe farming more sustainably, actually needs $3.50 just to break even.
Exactly. That farmer is instantly priced out of the market. They can't compete with the subsidized price.
So the subsidy isn't really support for the sector.
Yeah.
It becomes a weapon. It lowers the price floor for the giants.
Right.
And the source says the small guys just drown beneath them. It's like aid turned on its head.
That's the critical mechanism they identify. The money intended to stabilize food production actually accelerates market concentration. It fuels the growth of monopolies.
It's a feedback loop then. Public money funds private monopoly building.
A self-reinforcing loop, yeah. And it's not just crop subsidies either. These systems often heavily favor specific crops. Think corn, soy, wheat. Things that are easy to store, transport globally, and trade as commodities.
In industrial stuff.
The industrial stuff.
Yeah.
Which further strengthens the big global supply chains and pushes out farmers trying to grow diverse local food for their communities.
And the really galling part, the ethically tough part, is that even with all this money being spent, all this corporate capture, it's not like the system is actually succeeding at feeding everyone well.
Not even close. That's where the human cost comes in, and it's stark when you put it next to that $500 billion investment figure.
Give us the numbers.
Okay, so the sources remind us. Globally, 811 million people are going hungry, like chronic undernourishment, real hunger.
811 million, okay.
And then beyond that, there are 3 billion people, almost half the world, who can't afford a genuinely healthy, nutritious meal. They might be getting calories, maybe.
But not nourishment.
Not real nourishment. They're eating, but poorly.
Yeah.
Often processed foods heavy in subsidized ingredients like corn syrup or soy oil.
So the system fails over 800 million completely, and another 3 billion are getting subpar food. Meanwhile, the corporate side of the system, it just grows fatter every year, as the source puts it.
It really does act like a parasite in that framing.
I'd say.
It extracts financial value, massive amounts of it, and concentrates power, but fails at its fundamental social job.
It's incredibly efficient at making money for a few, and wildly inefficient at feeding people properly.
That's the paradox. And it's getting worse. The projections are, frankly, terrifying.
How so?
By 2030, just a few years away, the sources estimate the total cost of this misdirection, the wasted money, the health costs, the environmental damage could hit $1.7 trillion.
1.7 trillion. That's hard to even grasp.
It's like the accumulating interest on decades of bad policies, the bill coming due for a system built on extraction. And the authors, they have this really bleak way of putting it. They say, we are funding our own extinction in bulk.
Wow. Funding our own extinction. Let's pause on that. This architecture idea. Are we talking about something that just kind of happened, like neglect? Or is it saying this was built on purpose?
The sources are really clear on this. This isn't drift. It's not just, the market going a bit wrong. It's design.
Deliberate design.
Deliberate policy and legal choices. The subsidies were put in place. The regulations were weakened or shaped in specific ways. Market rules got rewritten, all favoring scale, concentration, and financial extraction. This isn't accidental. It has foundations.
Legal and regulatory foundations.
Exactly. And we need to look at those next. How the rules themselves, especially around tax and competition, were bent to protect and enable this concentration of power.
Okay, so if subsidies are the foundation, what are the beams and supports holding up this architecture of inequity? The sources point to regulations or maybe the lack of them.
Right. Specifically, how the rules around taxes and market competition have been shaped, or maybe ignored, to benefit the powerful. They talk about the tax code itself, describing it as bending in worship to big agricultural interest. They even call the result the tax loophole cathedral.
A cathedral suggests something big, imposing, maybe sacred and untouchable.
Exactly. And inside this cathedral, there are these specific sanctuaries, these loopholes, tailor-made for those who are already crowned, as they put it.
Okay, give us an example. How does the tax code help a giant corporation more than a small farmer?
One key thing mentioned is flexibility in income timing.
Income timing, how does that work?
Well, think about a small farmer. They probably get paid once, maybe twice a year, right, when the harvest comes in. Their income is tied pretty directly to that cycle.
Makes sense.
But a huge multinational company, they can play games. They use sophisticated accounting across dozens of international subsidiaries. They can shift profits on paper from a country where taxes are high to another where they're super low, like a tax haven.
Right, transfer pricing and all that.
Exactly. And even domestically, they can do things like delaying when they officially book their revenue or accelerating their deductions. Imagine writing off the entire cost of a brand new $50 million processing plant in 1 year using accelerated depreciation.
Which dramatically lowers their taxable income for that year, even if they made huge profits.
Precisely. It smooths out their tax burden over time, or sometimes makes it disappear almost entirely for certain periods. It means more capital stays with them, ready for reinvestment, for expansion, for buying out smaller competitors.
So these aren't just like clever accounting tricks. They're built into the tax code. They're policy decisions.
Codified policy decisions that shelter corporate capital. And it's not just income timing. The sources mentioned deductions that double as sanctuaries. Think about huge tax credits for fuel consumption, for massive fleets of trucks and ships.
Which small farmers don't have.
Right. Or massive R&D credits for developing chemical inputs, or investment tax credits for building those giant processing plants. These are all things that primarily benefit the industrial scale players.
Okay, so you've got subsidies tilting the field, and then the tax code actively sheltering the winnings of the biggest players. What else enables this?
The next piece is crucial. The decline, or as the sources put it, the death of antitrust.
Antitrust. Like preventing monopolies. That used to be a big deal, right? Teddy Roosevelt, trust busting.
Exactly. It used to be about fairness, about preventing too much economic power from concentrating, which inevitably leads to political corruption, too. The sources say trust busting used to mean justice.
So what happened? Why did the watchdogs learn to sleep, as they phrase it?
Well, the sources point to a major philosophical shift pushed heavily starting around the 70s and 80s by certain economists and legal scholars, particularly from the Chicago School.
Okay.
They argued that the only thing antitrust enforcement should care about is efficiency, specifically short-term consumer prices.
Just efficiency, not fairness, not preventing corruption, not resilience.
Nope. The main question became, will this merger make the resulting company more efficient? Will it, maybe, hypothetically, lower the price of a can of beans by 2 cents for the consumer? If the answer seemed to be yes, regulators often rubber-stamped it.
Even if it meant creating a giant company that controlled a huge chunk of the market.
Even then, they ignored the long-term risks of market concentration, the loss of competition, the impact on suppliers like farmers, the potential for future price gouging once competition was gone.
And the irony is, now we're seeing that, aren't we? Once you have that monopoly power, you can raise prices, and efficiency might even go down because there's no competitive pressure.
That's the exact outcome the sources describe. This focus solely on a narrow definition of efficiency created what they call regulatory amnesia, forgetting the original point of antitrust. And that amnesia directly paved the way for the hyper-concentration we see today.
The new trusts, as they call them.
The new trusts. The market didn't just magically concentrate itself. Policy, or the lack of active policy enforcement, allowed it, even encouraged it, in the name of this narrow idea of efficiency.
Okay, let's put some numbers on that concentration. This cartography of control idea. How much control do these few companies actually have?
The figures are pretty shocking, especially when you think about essential food items in the U.S., and it's increasingly similar globally. 4 companies, just 4, control 85% of all beef processing.
85%. So chances are, if you're eating beef, it went through one of their facilities.
Very high chance. Same for pork. 4 companies control 70% of the processing.
Okay. Meat is heavily concentrated. What about the absolute basics? Grains.
That's maybe the most concentrated point of all.
Oh.
Globally, 4 giant companies control 90% of the world's grain trading.
90%. Who are they?
They're often called the ABCD companies. Archer Daniels Midland, ADM, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus.
The ABCD of grain.
Yeah. Think about what 90% control means. 4 companies basically dictate the flow, the price, the storage, the shipping of the world's staple calories, wheat, corn, soy. The ingredients in almost everything processed.
This isn't just about selling grain, then. It's logistics, storage, information, futures markets.
It's total system control. They own the infrastructure. The giant grain elevators, the ports, the ships. They have immense informational advantages. They set the terms for the farmer growing the grain and the baker buying the flour.
So the sources conclude, this is not competition, it's cartography of control. They've literally drawn the map and they own all the key intersections.
That's the image. They control the choke points. And when you have that kind of control over the physical supply, well, it creates the perfect conditions for the next layer of extraction, turning food itself into just another financial asset to be speculated on.
Okay, so we've gone from the farm through the subsidies, past the weak regulations, into the boardrooms of these giant companies. Now we're heading somewhere else entirely, right? The trading floor.
Exactly. This is where the story takes a turn towards, well, outright speculation on human necessity. The fundamental shift is that food stops being primarily about nutrition or feeding people.
And
It becomes just another commodity to be traded for profit, like oil or gold or copper futures. It gets fully financialized.
So like the source says, hedge funds trade hunger.
That sums it up pretty brutally, yeah. And we're not talking about, say, a farmer using a futures contract to lock in a price for their crop to protect against bad weather. That's a traditional hedge.
Right, that makes sense. Managing risk.
This is different. This
Yeah.
is huge institutional investors, pension funds, investment banks, hedge funds, pouring billions into commodity markets purely to bet on price movements. They have no intention of ever touching the actual grain or soybeans.
They're just betting on the numbers going up or down.
Exactly. They're betting on volatility. They're detached from the physical reality of food production and consumption.
And do we know how much money they're making from this? Is it significant?
Oh, it's huge. The sources give a specific example. Between 2010 and 2012, that was a period when global food prices spiked dramatically, causing real hardship around the world.
I remember that. The Arab Spring was partly linked to food prices, wasn't it?
It was a major factor, yeah. Well, during that exact period, investment banks made $2.2 billion just from trading food commodity derivatives and indices.
2.2 billion. And just to be clear, they didn't make that by like growing more food or shipping it more efficiently.
Nope. They made it, as the source puts it, by predicting their starvation. They placed financial bets that the price of basic foods, wheat, corn, rice, would go up. And when hardship drove those prices up, their bets paid off massively.
That feels incredibly perverse.
Yeah.
Profiting directly from scarcity and potential starvation.
It leads to this really warped dynamic in the market. If you're a financial player making money off price swings, you actually don't want stability. You don't want predictable harvests and steady prices.
You want chaos.
You want volatility. The sources call this the volatility loop. When the price swings themselves become the product you're selling or betting on, then chaos becomes profit.
So things like geopolitical tension, extreme weather from climate change, supply chain disruptions, these aren't problems to be solved, they're opportunities.
For these specific financial actors, yes. Stability offers boring, low returns. Chaos, uncertainty. That's where the big, quick money can be made if you bet correctly. And the scary part is, this financial betting starts to influence the actual price we pay.
Oh.
Because the sheer volume of money pouring into these commodity markets can overwhelm the signals from actual supply and demand. The price of bread on the shelf stops being determined just by how much wheat was grown.
And starts being set by
whispers on a trading floor, as the source says. By algorithms reacting to news headlines, by fear, by speculation, happening hundreds or thousands of miles away from any farm or bakery.
Wow. And is there a recent example of this playing out, this crisis profiteering?
The clearest, most brutal recent example highlighted is the response to the war in Ukraine, starting in 2022.
Okay, yep. Huge grain exporter, obviously.
Exactly. Russia and Ukraine together supply a massive chunk of the world's wheat, corn, sunflower oil. When the war started, grain shipments from the Black Sea were immediately disrupted or threatened. Massive uncertainty hit the market.
So prices shot up.
They shot up.
Yeah.
But how did the financial players react? Their algorithms didn't see a human tragedy needing aid and solutions. They saw a price spike opportunity.
A buy signal.
A massive buy signal. And the numbers are stark. In 2022, while the war raged, the top 10 hedge funds involved in commodities trading made $1.9 billion just from trading grain.
$1.9 billion. While people worried about famine and supply lines were cut, they interpreted the bombs and the smoke as profit potential.
It shows this total disconnect, doesn't it? Crisis isn't a problem. It's an arbitrage opportunity. It's pure extraction from turmoil.
And this financial layer, this speculation, it sits on top of other problems further down the chain, right? It feeds into something the sources call the profit-price spiral.
Exactly. The speculation amplifies price swings, but the spiral starts earlier with the basic inputs for farming. Let's look at fertilizer.
Okay. Essential for industrial agriculture.
Totally. And making nitrogen fertilizer heavily relies on natural gas as a feedstock. So when global natural gas prices spiked recently,
Fertilizer prices went up too. That makes sense. Input costs rise.
they did rise. But here's the thing. The fertilizer industry is also highly concentrated. Just a few massive global companies control most of it.
Like the grain traders and meat packers. Same pattern.
Same pattern. So when their gas costs went up, did they just pass that cost along? No. They used the situation as cover to massively increase their profit margins. Their profits didn't just go up a bit, they multiplied fivefold. A 500% increase in profit.
Wait, 500%. So if their costs went up by, say, 50%, their profits went up by 500%. How is that possible?
Market power. Because farmers had to buy fertilizer and there were only a few sellers, those companies could basically charge whatever they wanted. The sources are blunt. Costs went up, but so did greed.
It wasn't just inflation. It was opportunistic profit-taking disguised as inflation.
That's the argument. Pure extraction, leveraging a crisis and their oligopoly control. And that inflated fertilizer cost then gets embedded in the price of every bushel of grain grown using it.
Okay, so let's trace that spiral the sources describe. It starts with energy prices.
Right. Energy prices go up. That inflates costs for the concentrated fertilizer giants.
Who then multiply their profits, not just pass on costs.
Exactly. That superinflated fertilizer cost gets passed on to farmers, who then have to charge more for their grain if they can.
Which the concentrated grain traders, the ABCD companies, buy.
Right. And that higher price, plus the inherent volatility, creates the perfect playground for the financial speculators to jump in and bet on further price swings, adding another layer of cost and instability.
So the chain is energy pack fertilizer, food pack finance.
That's the chain of rent extraction they map out. At each step where power is concentrated, an extra layer of profit, or rent, is skimmed off. It's not based on creating value, it's based on controlling a choke point.
And the result, the spiral tightens, prices go up, and as the source says, the consumer chokes and the speculator smiles.
A grim summary, but it captures the dynamic described.
So the extraction isn't just happening out in the open with subsidies or on the traded floor. There are quieter, more hidden ways value gets siphoned off, right? This idea of invisible extraction.
Yeah, absolutely. The system is also designed to hide profits, shift value around in ways that aren't immediately obvious. The sources use this fantastic term, corporate alchemy.
Alchemy, like turning lead into gold.
Sort of, but here it's more like turning taxable profits into untaxable profits somewhere else. The idea is that value isn't always created, it's often just rerouted. Moved around the globe strategically to minimize tax bills, hide profits from workers demanding fair wages, or keep it away from the original producers.
And how do they do that? What's the main tool?
A big one is using international tax havens combined with transfer pricing. That's basically setting artificial prices for goods and services exchanged between different subsidiaries of the same multinational company.
Okay, can you give a concrete example?
Sure. The source highlights the case of JBS. They're one of the world's biggest meat packers, based in Brazil, but massive globally.
Right.
They apparently used a complex web of offshore companies and internal transactions to effectively hide $442 million in known tax havens over a period.
$442 million.
Yep. That's profit that was likely generated from sales in countries with normal tax rates like the US or in Europe. But through internal accounting maneuvers, it ended up on the books of shell companies in places with zero or near zero taxes.
So that's $442 million that could have gone to public services, schools, roads, healthcare in the countries where they actually operated. But instead it just vanished into this offshore maze.
Vanished from the public purse, yeah. It demonstrates how this architecture of inequity isn't just national. It relies on this shadowy global network of financial secrecy.
And this kind of alchemy, this rerouting of money, it must make things even harder for the actual farmers, right? It feeds into what the sources called the middlemen paradox.
It absolutely does. The paradox is stark. You often see the farmers selling their crop or their livestock at a loss or maybe just scraping by, barely breaking even.
Yeah.
But then the middleman, the giant processor, the global distributor, the company that owns the brand you see in the supermarket, they sell the final product made from that same raw material at what the source calls a miracle price, a huge markup.
So where does all that extra money, that miracle profit margin, actually go if the farmer isn't getting it?
Well, the sources argue it kind of evaporates into these opaque categories, things like inflated logistics fees charged between the company's own subsidiary.
Yeah, more alchemy.
More alchemy. Or maybe brand premiums, the extra amount they charge just because their logo is on the package. The physical work of growing the food gets pennies, while the paperwork, the marketing, the financial engineering gets the dollars.
The value gets sucked out somewhere between the farm gate and the supermarket shelf.
Exactly. And we, as the people buying the food, we face the sharp end of this invisible extraction too, right there in the grocery store. The sources point out a couple of really common deceptive tactics.
Okay, what are they?
The first one is something we've probably all noticed, but the framing is sharp. Shrinkflation.
Ah, yeah. The packet of chips that seems lighter, the chocolate bar that got smaller.
Exactly. The source calls it how capital lies without speaking. It's deceptive because the price on the shelf often stays the same. $3.99 last month, $3.99 this month.
Looks stable.
Looks stable. But the amount of product inside the package has shrunk. You're paying the same price for less stuff.
It's inflation, but hidden. Stealth inflation. You're paying more per ounce or per gram without the sticker price changing.
Precisely. It's a way for the company to protect or increase its profit margin when its own costs go up, or even if they don't, without alarming consumers who are sensitive to obvious price hikes. It exploits our habits. We notice price changes more readily than subtle volume changes.
Sneaky. Okay, what's the second tactic?
The second one digs into psychology. It's about how companies manipulate our perception of value. The sources call it the psychology of brand worship.
Brand worship, like trusting a logo.
Essentially, yes.
No.
Corporations often justify high prices using what they call value-based pricing. Their argument goes something like this. You're not just paying for the raw ingredients in this box of cereal, which might cost pennies. You're paying for the brand.
The perceived quality, the reliability, the image.
The trust, the nostalgia, the lifestyle they've spent millions associating with that logo. You're paying for the feeling the brand gives you.
Okay, I can see how they'd argue that, but what's the critique?
The critique in our sources is pretty scathing. It argues this whole model relies on cultivating faith in logos that outlive the truth of what they sell.
Meaning?
Meaning, we keep paying a premium for the brand name out of habit or trust, even if the actual product inside the package has been cheapened over the years. Maybe using lower quality ingredients, smaller portions, less nutrition compared to what it used to be, or compared to a less famous competitor.
So we're paying for the marketing ghost of a product that might not exist anymore in the same form.
That's the idea. It's the ultimate form of control, isn't it? They don't just control the supply chain and the overt price. They manipulate your perception of value right at the point you make a choice, using decades of advertising to build that brand worship.
Wow, okay. So taken together, the alchemy, the middleman paradox, shrinkflation, brand worship, it paints a picture of a system that's not just flawed in its visible structure, but deliberately designed to extract value quietly, often deceptively, at every single step.
That's the powerful argument emerging from these sources. It's systemic, hidden, and incredibly effective at concentrating wealth, often at the consumer's and the producer's expense.
Right. It's easy to feel a bit powerless hearing all that. The scale of it, global companies, complex finance, hidden tactics, it sounds overwhelming.
It can definitely feel that way. The architecture seems so solid, so entrenched.
But here's where the sources pivot, and this is really important. They don't just leave us with the critique, they offer what they call a blueprint for change. Specific actions.
Yeah, this is the constructive part. And maybe the most empowering idea they put forward is that huge sum we started with, that $470 billion currently being misdirected every year.
A subsidy for monopoly.
Exactly. That money, they argue, isn't just waste. It could be the seed of a new economy. We actually have the resources needed for a transformation. We just need to redirect them.
You don't need to find new money. We need to spend the existing money differently.
That's the core message for change. And the first big action item follows directly from that, redirecting subsidies.
Okay, so stop funding the bad stuff, start funding the good stuff. Sounds simple, but what does that look like in practice?
It means fundamentally changing what we subsidize. Instead of paying based on sheer volume of commodity crops, like corn or soy, which often leads to monocultures and environmental issues, policy needs to tie financial support to positive outcomes. Things like improving soil health, conserving water, increasing biodiversity on farms, reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
So pay for environmental stewardship, basically. Link productivity to planetary health, as the source says.
Exactly. Make ecological health and resilience the goal. And, crucially, redirect that money towards local and regional food systems that are actually focused on feeding people nutritious food, not just pumping out raw materials for global commodity markets. Fund systems that feed people, not indexes.
And would this favor smaller, more diverse farms?
It should, yeah. The sources suggest these redesigned subsidies should prioritize small and medium-sized farms, especially those growing diverse, nutrient-dense foods for their local communities. Make public health and local resilience the metrics for success, not just tons of grain exported.
So, step 1, fix the money flow. Make the public good the thing being subsidized. What's next?
Step 2 is tackling that concentration of power head-on. The sources call for antitrust reborn, a serious return to breaking up monopolies.
Using those old trust-busting tools again.
Using them and maybe updating them for the modern economy. The call is to break them up. Get serious about dismantling the dominance of those giant meat packers, grain traders, and food processors.
And they mentioned something about algorithms, algorithmic collusion disguised as efficiency.
Right. This is a modern antitrust challenge. When you only have 3 or 4 huge companies in a sector, they don't necessarily need to have secret meetings to coordinate prices.
How does it work then?
Their pricing algorithms, all programmed to maximize profit based on the same market data, can effectively learn to keep prices high together. If one raises prices, the other's algorithms see that and often follow suit, knowing there's no real competitor to undercut them. It looks like market response, but it functions like collusion.
So antitrust needs to tackle that concentration itself, which enables this digital price coordination.
Exactly. Break up the vertical integration too. Make it so the company processing the meat is separate from the company distributing it, which is separate from the retailer. Restore genuine competition at each stage.
And the sources frame this not just as an economic fix, but almost morally. They say competition isn't chaos, it's democracy in economic form.
Yeah, the idea is that when markets are genuinely competitive, power is dispersed. Small businesses and farmers have more leverage, consumers have more choice, and the system is less vulnerable to corruption or capture by a few powerful players. It fosters economic participation.
Okay, so redirect subsidies, break up monopolies. What's the third pillar of this blueprint?
Transparency. Massive, radical transparency used as a defense mechanism. Transparency is defense.
How does being transparent defend against anything?
It defends against crisis profiteering and hidden price gouging. Remember the fertilizer companies jacking up profits by 500% during the energy crisis? Transparency would make that much harder. The idea is that prices must speak truth, especially during a crisis, a pandemic, a war, a drought. There should be mandatory requirements for major companies in essential sectors like food and energy to publicly disclose their actual costs versus their markups.
So they'd have to literally show the cost, the markup, the greed, as the source puts it.
That's the idea. If everyone can see that a company's input costs went up 10%, but their prices went up 50%, the opportunistic profiteering becomes obvious. It's much harder to hide behind vague claims of inflation or supply chain issues.
Sunlight as disinfectant.
Exactly. The sources say light is the only regulator that never sleeps. Transparency empowers consumers, regulators, and even ethical competitors. It disarms the power that comes from controlling information.
Okay, those are big policy shifts. Redirect subsidies, revive antitrust, enforce transparency. Is there anything else? More grassroots, maybe?
Yes, the final piece moves beyond government policy towards community-level structure and organization. It's called the co-op and decentralization revolution.
Co-ops, like food cooperatives.
Exactly. Farmer co-ops, worker co-ops, consumer co-ops. Businesses owned and democratically controlled by their members, not by distant shareholders. The blueprint sees these as crucial.
Why? What's the advantage?
They fundamentally change the flow of value. Instead of profits being extracted and sent out to corporate headquarters or tax havens, in a co-op, the value tends to stay local. It circulates within the community, benefiting the farmers who produce the food, the workers who process it, and the consumers who buy it. The goal is for value to circulate like oxygen, not currency.
Oxygen nourishing the local system instead of currency being sucked out. I like that metaphor.
Me too. And connected to this is decentralization. Building more resilient, localized food infrastructure, local processing facilities, regional food hubs, farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, CSAs.
So not relying entirely on those massive, fragile, global supply chains.
Precisely. Decentralization is presented as a strategic defense. If one part of the global system breaks down due to a pandemic, a war, a climate disaster, a region with strong local food systems is far less vulnerable. It builds resilience.
And the sources suggest this has a healing effect.
Yeah, they say when value stays close to where food is grown, when producers and consumers are connected, systems heal themselves. It's about rebuilding local economic ecosystems based on mutual support and circulation, directly countering the extraction model.
So it really comes full circle. The architecture of inequity was built by policy and finance.
Deliberately built.
And it can be deliberately dismantled and rebuilt using new policies for subsidies and antitrust, new financial models like co-ops, and a commitment to transparency and decentralization.
Absolutely. The blueprint is there. It requires political will, financial redirection, and maybe a shift in how we all think about where our food comes from and who benefits from the system. But the sources argue it's entirely possible. #tag67. Outro, synthesis and provocation.
Wow. Okay. That was a lot. A really deep dive into a system that affects every single one of us, every single day. Let's try to quickly pull out the key takeaways, the things you, listening, should really hold on to from this.
For me, the first is just the sheer scale of that misdirected money. That $540 billion annual investment
Yeah.
with $470 billion, 87% of it, going to prop up the powerful, acting as scaffolding for oligopoly. That number itself is the core problem and maybe the core solution if redirected.
Right. And then the stark reality of the financialization, that $1.9 billion in hedge fund profits from grain trading during the Ukraine crisis in 2022.
Proof that chaos becomes profit, that human suffering can be just another commodity to bet on. That really sticks with you.
It does, and underpinning all that, the necessity for real antitrust action, antitrust reborn, as they call it. You can't fix the system if 4 companies control 90% of the grain trade. That cartography of control has to be redrawn.
Definitely. But the hope lies in knowing that the alternative blueprint, the no-ops, the decentralization, the transparency, it already exists. It's not purely theoretical.
Yeah, which leads to that final quote from the source material. It's powerful, maybe a bit shocking, but really sums it up.
Which one is that?
A system that feeds profit instead of people is not a system, it's a crime scene. But every crime scene is also a blueprint.
Wow. Okay. A crime scene, but also a blueprint. The evidence of how it went wrong shows you exactly where the weaknesses are, where you need to rebuild.
It turns the critique into a map for reconstruction, doesn't it? It challenges us not just to be angry about the problem, but to actually get involved in fixing it.
Precisely.
So let's leave you, our listeners, with a question to chew on. A provocation based on that idea of rebuilding. If this whole architecture of inequity was largely built by big top-down policies and global finance, what's the one specific, concrete, local policy change you think is most needed in your own community?
Yeah, think small scale. Your town, your city, your state or region.
What's the single most urgent local change that could help ensure food value circulates like that oxygen, benefiting the community instead of just flowing out to those distant monopolies and financial centers?
Where's the local leak? And what's the smallest, maybe simplest policy plug you could imagine to start fixing it? Something tangible.
Think about that. What does the blueprint look like where you live? Keep diving deep. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.